Some men fear their opponents, others fear failure, but Jon Jones, he became the most feared fighter in the world. The scariest thing about Jon Jones isn't what he has done inside the cage, it's what he has done outside of it. Hit and run, multiple failed drug tests, and borderline aggravated DUI. This is a man obsessed with becoming the greatest fighter on earth, a mind built for dominance, yet incapable of control. Alas, he spent his UFC days fighting his own demons, all while serving probation and brief stints behind bars. Here is the insane true story of Jon Jones. Jon Jones' path to combat began in an unexpected place, his own home. Born in 1987 in Rochester, New York, Jones was raised in a strict household with no cable TV, no secular music, no late nights out. His world was small. But in the basement, a wrestling mat became his battleground. His sparring partners were Arthur and Chandler Jones, his brothers. By 2005, he had captured a New York State wrestling title. Iowa and Iowa State saw his potential, but his grades didn't make the cut. Instead, he found himself at Iowa Central Community College, where he would win a JUCO national championship. Then, everything changed. Jones' girlfriend became pregnant. Wrestling no longer seemed like the path forward. He dropped out, he took a job as a bouncer, uncertain of his future. However, a random message on Twitter told him to check out a local MMA gym called Bomb Squad in Cortland, New York. On a whim, he walked in, and just 5 months later, Jon Jones made his professional MMA debut. It was a Holiday Inn ballroom, and his opponent is a self-proclaimed brawler. Jon ragdolled him, and the fight was over in 90 seconds. From there, his rise was extremely ridiculous. 5 straight finishes, and he earned the nickname Chocolate Jones. Within 4 months of turning pro, Jon Jones was in the UFC. At UFC 87, he took a short-notice fight against Andre Guzmo. He was just 21 years old with an 84.5-inch reach, a freak of nature, and so he won. He became unstoppable until he wasn't. At just 23, he became the youngest champion in UFC history, an athlete whose talent knew no limits. But outside the cage, the battles were different, chaotic, reckless, and deeply personal. Born into a family of elite athletes, Jones was raised in a household of faith and discipline. While his brothers excelled in the NFL, Jon carved his own path through the brutal world of mixed martial arts. It turned out that the death of his sister left a wound that never quite healed. Driven by an unrelenting hunger for greatness, he trained with single-minded focus, sacrificing everything for a singular goal: to be the best. December 2009, the Tough 10 final. Jones was destroying Matt Hamill. Then, in a moment of inexperience, he landed illegal 12-6 elbows, so he was disqualified and handed his very first loss. But Jones moved on, finishing Brandon Vera and Vladimir Matushenko in brutal fashion. Suddenly, his teammate, Rashad Evans, was out of his title fight with an injury. The UFC needed a replacement, and Jones had 6 weeks to prepare for Mauricio Shogun Rua, the light heavyweight champion. So the world watched as Jones demolished Shogun at UFC 128, while he was just 23. On that night, history was made as Jones became the youngest champion in UFC history, a record that still stands to this day. And just hours before the fight, Jones stopped a mugger in the streets of New Jersey. It was the kind of story that made him a legend. The victory celebration, though, was short-lived. The UFC wasted no time in bringing Rashad Evans into the cage, setting the stage for a blockbuster showdown, champion versus former teammate. But this wasn't just any rivalry. This was personal. Feeling betrayed by his coaches at Jackson Wink MMA, Evans walked away from the camp that had helped him shape his career. So the highly anticipated clash wouldn't happen, at least not yet. A few months later, Jones suffered a torn ligament in his thumb, an injury expected to sideline him for the rest of the year. Instead, Evans took on and defeated Phil Davis, making him the next challenger for the light heavyweight throne. As it turns out, Jones's injury wasn't as serious as first believed. The UFC pivoted, and instead of Evans, Jones would face former champion and fan favorite Rampage Jackson at UFC 135 in his first ever title defense. It wasn't just a victory, it was a masterclass. Jones dominated from start to finish, securing a 4th round submission in flawless. Then, at last, the bitter feud between Jones and Evans could be settled. At UFC 145, 2 former teammates met in the octagon, but only one was still evolving. Jones dismantled Evans across 5 rounds, outstriking him 116-49 and stuffing every takedown attempt. This was a masterful one-sided victory. But just as Jones seemed unstoppable inside the cage, his troubles outside of it were only beginning. The world watched as the cracks in his empire began to show. Talent alone couldn't shield him from the consequences of his choices. A series of of arrests, controversies, and personal struggles turned the legend into a villain. A few weeks after his win over Evans, Jones was arrested in New York for a DWI after crashing his Bentley into a utility pole. The golden boy image he had worked so hard to cultivate took a devastating hit. Many had already questioned the authenticity of his clean-cut persona. Now, they saw this as proof. Then came the Nike deal, the first of its kind in MMA history, but rather than shutting his critics, it only fueled their resentment. But this was just before the real disaster, UFC 151. Jones was set to defend his title against Dan Henderson, but when Henderson pulled out with an injury just days before the fight, the UFC scrambled for a replacement, Chael Sonnen, a man who could sell a fight like no other, but Jones refused the bout on short notice. For the first time ever, the UFC canceled an event. Fans blamed Jones, Dana White blamed Jones, and Chael Sonnen blamed Jones. Eventually, Jones was in the eyes of many, making him MMA's public enemy number one. Meanwhile, the rift between Jones and the UFC was growing. In an effort to mend fences, the UFC booked Jones and Sonnen as opposing coaches for The Ultimate Fighter, leading to a long-awaited clash at UFC 159. The fight, however, was anything but competitive, but somehow, Jones steamrolled Sonnen in the first round, securing yet another title defense. Even after enduring a positive career at the beginning, it took just over a year before his weaknesses were revealed. In May of 2012, Jon Jones crashed his Bentley into a pole while driving under the influence again. The result was a $1,000 fine and a 6-month driving suspension. On paper, it seemed like a minor setback, but in reality, it was the beginning of a troubling pattern, one that would follow him for years to come. After a dominant title defense against Glover Teixeira at UFC 172, it was time for the rematch against Gustafsson at UFC 178. However, the UFC fighter tore his meniscus and was replaced by an undefeated Olympian turned heavyweight turned light heavyweight, Daniel Cormier. From the moment Cormier entered the UFC, he had one goal: to dethrone Jon Jones, and he let the world know it. But despite the chaos, the result inside the cage was the same. At UFC 182, Jones did what no one thought possible. He dominated the Olympic wrestler in the clinch, stuffed takedowns, and outworked Cormier across 5 grueling rounds. After the last round, Jones stood at the top of the MMA world. He had just defeated his greatest career rival, Daniel Cormier, in one of the most anticipated fights in UFC history, but just 3 days later, a shocking revelation emerged. Jones had tested positive for cocaine in a pre-fight drug screening. Technically, the test had been conducted over a month before the fight, meaning the result didn't affect the official outcome. His victory remained intact, but his reputation took another major hit. In an apparent effort to address the controversy, Jones checked himself into a rehabilitation facility. The media praised what seemed like a turning point, an athlete taking responsibility and confronting his demons. But the truth is that he left after just one night. This was more than just another PR disaster. For Jones, it became a vicious cycle. Relief, followed by guilt, followed by self-destruction. Publicly, he preached discipline and hard work, but privately, he was caught in a web of contradictions. Jones would later claim that he wasn't a habitual user, but this wasn't just a one-time lapse in judgment. It was a dangerous pattern, one that was about to transition into something far worse than anyone could have imagined. Even after being caught using performance-enhancing drugs, Jones couldn't keep his record clean. It wasn't long before he was arrested once again. After another night of partying and drinking, Jones made a decision that would change his life forever. He ran a red light, but he crashed into another vehicle, which then collided with a third. But instead of staying at the scene, he panicked and ran away. Later, Jones would try to justify his actions, but his only concern was himself, how bad it would look, what it would mean for his career. He never stopped to check if anyone else was hurt. He never considered the possibility that there could have been a child in the car that he hit. The whole situation went wild when it was discovered that the woman in the other vehicle was pregnant. Luckily, she survived without fatal injuries, but the damage was already done. It became a complete disregard for others in a moment of crisis. At the time of the crash, Jon Jones had no idea who was in the other vehicle, but when he finally discovered the truth that he had struck a pregnant woman, the weight of the moment should have sunk in, but it didn't. Not once did he mention the victim. Not once did he express remorse. Jones's immediate concern wasn't the life that he had endangered, it was instead his own, his freedom, his future, the very definition of self-preservation. And in that moment, fleeing the scene felt like just another escape. But there was no escaping this. The next day, Jon Jones turned himself in. He was released on a $2,500 bond, but the damage was already done. The UFC stripped him of his light heavyweight title and suspended him indefinitely. His reign at the top had crumbled, not because of an opponent in the cage, but because of his own actions outside of it. Jones vowed to change, but the villain of the story wasn't done yet. When police searched his abandoned car, they found cash, a rental agreement in his name, and marijuana paraphernalia. Jon Jones, the reigning UFC champion, was now a fugitive. His career, once seemingly unstoppable, was now in freefall. After another minor run-in with the law involving a vehicle, Jones was finally set to return. The UFC announced his comeback at UFC 197, where he would fight to reclaim the title, now held by his longtime rival, Daniel Cormier. But fate intervened. Cormier was injured, and instead Jones faced Ovince St. Preux for an interim belt. It was far from his best performance. Sluggish, uninspired, but he got the job done, setting up one of the most anticipated rematches in UFC history, Jones vs. Cormier 2 at UFC 200. Then, disaster struck again. 2 days before the fight, USADA announced that Jones had tested positive for estrogen blockers, substances commonly used to mask steroid use. Jones blamed a contaminated gas station supplement, a defense USDA found plausible, but Nevada was less forgiving. Jones was pulled from the card, stripped of his interim title, and suspended for a year. 3 weeks after his suspension ended, Jones finally got his rematch with Cormier at UFC 214. This time, there was no controversy, just a definitive finish. After 2 competitive rounds, Jones landed a head kick in the third, securing a knockout victory and reclaiming his throne. It was supposed to be the start of a new era, but instead, it became yet another tragic lesson. Just days after his victory, the USDA revealed that Jones's pre-fight drug test had come back positive for turinabol, an anabolic steroid. His win over Cormier was overturned. His title was stripped for the 3rd time, and he faced up to 4 years of suspension. After arbitration, his ban was reduced to just 15 months due to evidence of unintentional ingestion and his cooperation with the USADA. When Jones finally returned at UFC 232, the drama followed him yet again. Trace amounts of the same banned substance were still in his system. Experts claimed pulsing, but the USADA determined it wasn't from re-ingestion. Nevada wasn't convinced, so just days before the fight, the entire UFC 232 event was moved from Las Vegas to California. It was a logistical nightmare, but the fight went on. Jones dominated Alexander Gustafsson in their rematch, finishing him in the 3rd round to once again reclaim the light heavyweight title. For the next year, Jones remained champion, defending his belt against Anthony Smith, Diego Santos, and Dominic Reyes. But while he was still winning, the performances were less convincing each time. The Reyes fight in particular was razor thin, and many believed Jones had finally lost. And outside the cage, the troubles continued. In 2020, just 2 months after the Reyes fight, Jones was arrested for an aggravated DWI and negligent use of a firearm after an incident during the COVID lockdown. Another slap on the wrist followed, house arrest, probation, and community service. But then, negotiations for a super fight with Francis Ngannou fell apart over money. Frustrated, Jones vacated his light heavyweight title and began preparing for a move to heavyweight, waiting for the right payday. In 2021, his first fight with Gustafsson was inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame. That same night, Jones was arrested again, this time for misdemeanor domestic violence involving his fiancée and felony police vehicle tampering. The domestic charge was later dropped, but the damage was done. His longtime gym, Jackson Wink MMA, banned him from training there. Jones moved to a new camp, Fight Ready, under the guidance of Henry Cejudo. Jon Jones made his long-awaited return to the UFC on March 4th, 2023, at UFC 285 after a 3-year hiatus. He moved up to heavyweight and faced Cyril Gane for the vacant UFC Heavyweight Championship. Jones won the fight in dominant fashion, submitting Gane in the first round to become the UFC Heavyweight Champion. And that is where his story stands. Since then, he's been recovering from an injury that forced him to pull out of his scheduled fight against Stipe Miocic in 2023. And now, the final chapter of Jon Jones awaits.